Hi, my name is Emily Olsen. I am a member of the Dante Society of America and a graduate of NYU's Visual Arts Administration program. And today I'm talking about Canto 5 of Paradiso with my friend Erick. Hi, Erick. Thanks for joining.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Erick Spahr. I'm currently doing my doctoral research at University of Oxford in philosophy, and my main research interests currently are Heidegger and Kierkegaard.
Great. And so for Paradiso, Canto 5, we've just left, or we're in the process of leaving the lunar realm. Dante's with Beatrice, and they're going from the moon to Mercury. And as they are in transit, they are furthering the conversation started in Canto 4 about vows unfulfilled. In Canto 4, we see examples of vows unfulfilled through violence. And as the conversation progresses, we talk about what's essentially the breakdown of a vow, and Beatrice outlines that. The two components are a sacrifice, the matter of the pledge, and then the formal compact one accepts, and this is lines 43 through 45. And she also emphasizes to Dante that the greatest gift to mankind is free will, and therefore the strongest currency you have in making these vows, especially with God, is your free will. So, Erick, would you like to open us up with any thoughts on that?
Yeah, interesting to me some of the examples that were given of people who did not exercise their free will in the proper way, and some of the historical figures or mythological figures that were referenced in this. So we have two given to us around line 64. Beatrice says, "Let mortals never take a vow in jest. Be faithful and yet circumspect, not rash as Jephthah was, in offering his first gift. He should have said, 'I did amiss,' and not done worse by keeping faith. And you can find that same stupidity in the Greeks' chief, when her fair face made Iphigenia grieve, and made the wise and made the foolish weep for her when they heard tell of such a rite." So referenced here is Jephthah from Book of Judges, who in exchange for victory in the battle decided that he would offer the first thing that walked through his house's door as a burnt offering to God. And I guess he expected livestock or something of the sort to come through, and instead his daughter walked through. And he did hold up his end of the bargain, and was, considered very unfortunate for having done so. And there's been debate over whether or not he was right, and or for what purpose God would have allowed this, but that's tangential at this point. Then we have Agamemnon, who, for similar reasons, was compelled to offer his own daughter as a sacrifice for having wronged one of the gods. And in both these cases, there was something comprehensible about the nature of their situation. It was this for that. There was something transactional about it. And they offered something very specific for something which was predetermined ahead of time. And there's one figure who seems like should be listed among these characters, but isn't, because he had a very different outcome. And that is, of course, Abraham. And the question is, Abraham was also called by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. And the sacrifice didn't happen, but that seems almost incidental to the character of the arrangement. So the question is, why do we consider Abraham to be one of the paragons of faith and not as one of these very classically tragic figures? And I think the reason for that is that Abraham, the content of his vow wasn't specific, it was absolute. So what he pledged to God was his complete self, his complete existence, his complete obedience. There was no sense of this for that. So when God approached him with the demand to sacrifice Isaac, there was no sense of, in fact, there was no defense given. It was just, here's what I command, you need to do this. And when he commanded differently, when he found the ram in the thicket and told Abraham to go sacrifice that instead, even though the manifestation of the vow might be slightly altered, the content of the vow hadn't changed at all. So Abraham, therefore, wasn't in any way liable for the difference. And I think because everything was left to God, essentially, that's why he was able to, I guess, transverse the situation in a different way.
Absolutely. And that especially with regards to Jephthah and Agamemnon, that transactional nature of the vow versus the absolute, what it reminded me of is Sybil in Metamorphosis, who's not referenced in this canto either. She's not, but that story of requesting of a god immortality without specifying youth with immortality. And so she gets her wish, but it goes horribly wrong because what she wanted, she wasn't fully thinking about exactly the specifics of this pact or this request that she's making. And I do think that what's interesting about it, is specifically as it relates to this canto, is Beatrice is aware that you can't make something like free will transactional. It has to be dealt with in these absolutes. And what's also really interesting about this canto, I think, is that this drilling down into the anatomy of what makes up a vow and also how you can renegotiate, but it's at a much, much steeper price, is that we're getting into these incremental expansions on Dante's understanding as we are proceeding deeper into Paradiso. And I think part of what is interesting about that incremental expansion is how the canto is framed by these tercets specifically about light and being blinded or overcome with divine light. And so we have, at the beginning of the canto, we have Beatrice speaking, "If in the fire of love I seem to flame beyond the measure visible on earth, so that I overcome your vision's force, you need not wonder, I am so because of my perfected vision. As I grasp the good, so I approach the good in act." And just this aspect of Beatrice and her perfected vision is fascinating to me because she explicitly tells Dante that he can't fully see everything. And she has to go through explaining these processes of vow making and fulfilling those vows.
Yeah, I agree. This tension between this kind of very codified, very methodical explanation of what goes into a vow and what's comprehensible, meeting this inherently incomprehensible nature of their journey, framed with the, because usually when you think of light, it's light illuminates, light helps you see things, and yet in this case, it's too much light. It has the exact opposite effect. And so for as much stress is put on perfecting the intellect, and it seems like in some cases the will might actually get the upper hand here, because it seems like as long as he's willing to continue, or as long as he's given, in some cases, the strength to continue, his intellectual understanding almost comes second. And there, when I first read this, and when I first read those opening and closing tercets, as you mentioned, it actually reminded me a lot of Pseudo-Dionysius. So in the end here, it's lines 136 and or thereabouts. He says, just as the sun, when heat has worn away thick mists that moderate its rays, conceals itself from sight through an excess of light, so did that holy form through excess gladness conceal himself from me within his rays. And so concealed, he answered me, even as the next canto is to sing. Now, of course, he can't recognize who the figure is, but the point is that he's actually concealed through an excess of light. And so, as I said, Pseudo-Dionysius has a similarly hierarchical, very Neoplatonist view of this kind of other world. And in his introduction to the mystical theology, he has a similar view of light and darkness and understanding and too much light. In the invocation, he says, "Trinity higher than any being, any divinity, any goodness, guide of Christians in the wisdom of heaven, lead us up beyond unknowing and light, up to the farthest, highest peak of mystic scripture, where the mysteries of God's word lie simple, absolute, and unchangeable in the brilliant darkness of a hidden silence. Amid the deepest shadow, they pour overwhelming light on what is most manifest. Amid the holy unsensed and unseen, they completely fill our sightless minds with treasures beyond all beauty. For this I pray, and Timothy, my friend, the recipient of this particular writing, my advice to you as you look for a sight of the mysterious things is to leave behind you everything perceived and understood, everything perceptible and understandable, all that is not and all that is, and with your understanding laid aside, to strive upward as much as you can towards union with him who is beyond all being and knowledge. By an undivided and absolute abandonment of yourself and everything, shedding all and freed from all, you will be uplifted to the ray of the divine shadow which is above everything that is. And this, I think, is a very beautiful and a very similar description of the nature of this kind of ascent through these other realms, where almost, once you are forced to deal with something that's wholly alien and totally non-terrestrial as it relates to the understanding, what else do you have to offer but this complete abandonment of yourself to whatever it is that's waiting for you, which I think is exactly this kind of fulcrum between the abandonment of Abraham and the kind of more transactional natures of these covenants as these being warned against.
Absolutely. And that actually, specifically with the passage you just read, what struck me, particularly as we deal with Paradiso, is talking about like the brilliant dark. And so with the terse that you mentioned in Canto of just the concealed, he answered me. And we were navigating through space from Mercury. He's talking to the soul of Justinian on Mercury, who will be in conversation with Dante formally in Canto 5. Canto 6, we're in Canto 5. And the brilliant darkness, I think, resonates with me in particular, thinking about Paradiso as this voyage through space, which, as Dante would have understood it, and how we see it is just this darkness kind of shot through with stars. And what resonated with you is adjacent to what struck me as I was reading through this in 2021 of, I was reminded recently, there's a book by Lisa Masseri about exoplanet research. It's Placing Outer Space, an earthly ethnography of other worlds. And she talks about how exoplanet scientists, through different ways, are examining exoplanets as other worlds, and that process of placemaking these planets, of thinking about them as worlds so that we can better understand them and imagine them, and through that better understand our place on our own world or our own planet. And she talks about the different ways that exoplanet scientists do this in her book, but it reminded me, one of the ways that this happens is through visualization and artistic rendering and narrative. And it struck me as a modern and contemporary iteration of something very similar to what Dante is doing in his time of he's mapping his place in the universe and the place of souls celestially, but also each of the celestial realms talked about in Paradiso get these arts assigned to them thematically. The moon is the realm of grammar, Mercury gets dialectics and language, Venus rhetoric, and Mars music, and it continues. And I just think that it's a really, really cool way to look at it, specifically using the arts to understand different aspects of these imagined worlds. And it tied really neatly. And then I also think that that's one of the reasons why this work has such an interesting cultural resonance. As I was telling you before this particular conversation, the astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti, she's an Italian astronaut, she read the first tercet of Paradiso on the International Space Station to celebrate the poet's birthday in 2015. But that's just one of the reasons why I love Paradiso so much.
Yeah, that's a really neat link. And I think there is something to be said for the sense that, in order to kind of venture out beyond our current boundaries, we do have to bring a bit of mapping with us. And this sense that maybe we're not doing absolute mapping of the cosmos, or Dante wasn't in that sense. As in like this planet lies at this particular spatial coordinate, and but it's the fact that he's doing relative mapping. So he's trying to say, is every word of this literally, theologically, physically true in a binding sense? Most likely not. But at the same time, does it matter? Most likely not. The important part is being able to place certain vices, certain virtues, certain experiences in relative position to each other to help us make sense of what it is we're trying to get through here.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. And regarding specifically how he's framing this conversation about free will in terms of light and divine light, a huge part of that is that he seems very aware and very self-conscious that he cannot fully grasp essentially what he's talking about regarding vows and free will, precisely because he doesn't have that perfected vision. He doesn't have the whole story or the whole set of information. And so he also can't fully relate it to the reader through language because he also doesn't have that full understanding. And when he's presented with more information and explanation, he gets consistently blinded by divine light as he moves forward. So we've talked about the ways in which this canto is very, or at least my reflection of how it relates to 2021. But did anything strike you in the current context or the contemporary time as you were reading it?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think it has a lot to offer in general, even though this is a bit of a strange canto because of how transitional it is and how, most of it alternates between this, this blindness on both ends, really, and then these somewhat dry discussions of what goes into a vow. But I think one of the main takeaways that could be useful is the importance of will and the importance of this relationship between perfected vision, intellect, and this kind of existential change that takes place as these things all work in tandem to kind of bring you up through this relative hierarchy. And while it might be a bit of an ask to expect, most people in 2021 to apply this to some sort of mystic union, as you might see in the Divine Comedy or in Pseudo-Dionysius, or even the type of absolute devotion that Kierkegaard was after in his discussion of Abraham in Fear and Trembling. I think that the seriousness of where your will is applied and where your attention is applied might have something to offer, because it seems that there are a few things more demanded of anybody today than your attention. Everything you see online, for example, most things aren't even after your money anymore. They're after your clicks. They're after your attention. They're after, just taking a little slice of your day and devoting it to something of their choosing. And I can't help but think of Heidegger on this one, because his conception of the self is somewhat more radical than a lot of the ones we would have inherited. So, for example, he doesn't see the self as having any discrete essence that's kind of transmuted perfectly in place, or he doesn't see it as being some sort of disembodied Cartesian consciousness that just so happens to inhabit a body, and now we have to make sense of things. He sees our sense of self quite literally as being constituted by and with the world that we experience. So the things that we choose to take up, or the places we direct our attention, feed back into our experience of ourself. So what, weirdly enough, I think links up with this give and take between the intellect, the will, and the changes we undergo. So I think, if there's any takeaway for somebody in 2021, it's just, I think, being especially cognizant of this link, because so much of the world we currently inhabit seems devoted to separating you uncritically from your attention, and kind of what the implications of that might be. Kind of, as you go through your day, these small little vows you make with various things, various people, kind of what the implications of these might be. And I guess being, almost taking yourself seriously enough to care.
Absolutely. That's a really, really neat link, especially because of the emphasis that Beatrice and therefore Dante puts on free will as exactly the greatest thing we could give. And then these little implicit transactions, I'm thinking mostly of social media and marketing, but exactly with how we interface with the world at large, and then at the end through higher just systems at work. And that relates, I think, to the larger line that runs through Paradiso and really the Divine Comedy, is that you may be subject to influence, but your will is still very much your own. And I do think that that is, I mean, we can keep talking about this for ages, but I do think that we should wrap up. But Erick, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.